Wave.
All right. Good morning, everyone. I am Jennifer Slattery with the League of Cities and Towns. We're joined here today by Ernie Almonte, our director, and Jordan Day. I did see, there she is, our associate director. And we're pleased to have guests with us today from our colleagues at RIPEC, Michael DeBiase and Justin Oliva, who are going to present on their latest data on municipal government. So in order to not take up too much time, I just want to thank you all for attending, and thank you, Mike and Justine, and I will turn it over to you.
Good morning, and thank you for joining. I think I've seen some of you before. Patricia, good to see you. I want to thank the League for the opportunity to speak to you this morning. Many of you know the Rhode Island Public Expenditure Council, but we're just, if you don't, we're a 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. We spend our time mostly on budget and taxes. We do research reports, and we also focus on K through 12 education. We're going to start getting involved in housing. So I'll be presenting on a report, and Justine Oliva will be helping me, that we published about a month ago on municipal services in Rhode Island. And I hope you'll find it interesting and useful. I'm going to go through a fairly long slide presentation fairly quickly, so we have some time for questions at the end. So go to the next slide. So just to get a little more specific about the report looks at how cities and towns in Rhode Island allocate their resources, and we're focusing mostly on the non-education side of municipal government. We did some reports on education funding, where we're hoping that this will give some perspective about how you can compare and benchmark expenditures for those of you in municipal government. And actually, this is the fourth of 5 reports we're going to do on municipal finance, and it reflects a feeling that this area does not get enough attention, and that actually our most pressing fiscal issues in Rhode Island, in our opinion, are at the local level rather than the state level. So all of these reports are available on our website, ripec.org. Let's go to the next slide. Here's what we're going to cover today. We're going to start with why municipal services matter, which I don't think we need to actually promote too much for those of you on the call. And then a little bit about historical and legal framework. And then we're going to look at the state kind of as a whole, and then drill down to compare certain municipalities. And then, as usual, we have some point of view to share with you. So why it matters. So local services and local government are closest to the people, and a lot of those services relate most broadly with quality life in the community, and they tend to be services that are provided generally to the community. It's also the case that we spend a lot on this. It's actually over $500 million in total when you include education. And when you take out education, it's closing in on $3 billion in FY20. And as I told you, we did exclude education. You'll see a little bit in this presentation, but both because we covered it in a prior report, but also state and federal money plays a much bigger role in K through 12 education funding. And there are big differences among communities. So in our report, we actually spend a lot of time on history. So those of you who like history, I think you'll find interesting, how did we start to have police forces and fire departments? And we think it's important because, a lot of the way things are is how they came to be over time. And so I encourage you, we're not going to spend much time on it today, but I would encourage you to look at some of the history in the report itself. So wanted to just touch on municipal home rule. So in colonial times, cities and towns were at the top of the food chain. The state was really not as important. We were actually, the colony was actually a collection of independent towns. But through industrialization, the state became much more important and sort of overwhelmed cities and towns in terms of powers. And that this whole tension back and forth culminated with Constitutional Convention in 1951 that created this Home Rule Amendment, which you probably heard about in the Rhode Island Constitution. And what it did was said that the cities and towns have a right to govern themselves with respect to local matters and can do charters, and all but one community has actually adopted a charter. But the General Assembly reserved the powers to enact laws of general application that apply to all cities and towns, and also did not give power, and this is important, to cities and towns to raise revenue or borrow. So communities need to get General Assembly approval for those powers. And for example, the right to levy property taxes is actually granted by statute. It's not an inherent power of the municipalities. And so so the Home Rule Amendment actually creates a dilemma, because the state can impose requirements on cities and towns and costs, but the cities and towns can only raise revenue through the limited powers granted to them by the state. And also they don't like to raise taxes on their people. So that this led to this statute in the late 1970s, which basically said that the state has to keep track of all these mandates, and cities and towns, you know, have the right to ask for reimbursement. But it never really worked, and cities and towns never got much in the way of reimbursement. And as far as we can tell, even though the state keeps track of all these things, there hasn't been anything for about 30 years in terms of reimbursement. So I wouldn't hope to get reimbursement under this. Let's move to, want to talk a little bit about, so Rhode Island is pretty unusual among states that we have no county government. So Connecticut is the only other state without county functions. Other New England states have fairly, just lost my light, fairly limited county functions. For example, Massachusetts has some, but they're pretty small compared to other states. And so we only have then one layer of local government, and it consists of municipalities, which are general purpose, the cities and towns general purpose governments, and special purpose governments, which are school districts and fire districts and other kind of special service functions. So in one sense, we're efficient because we don't have that other layer of, that extra layer of government between the state and the cities and towns. So we don't have as much of what's referred to in the academic literature as vertical fragmentation. But we do have, at least by one perspective, horizontal fragmentation, in that we have a high concentration of small governments with respect to geography. And so, so we have governments that perform essentially the same functions right next to each other. You know, one example is Barrington, Warren, Bristol are relatively small communities all adjacent that you know, actually perform pretty much the same functions for their citizens. The research suggests that consolidation of governments or services tend to make sense up to the 20,000 to 40,000 in population range, so that, you know, communities under 20,000 have some inherent inefficiencies with respect to economies of scale. What's interesting here is once you go past 40,000, the research suggests that you don't really have much benefit. So a lot of people say, well, we should just have like one big city. There may be reasons to do that, but they're not necessarily because of economies of scale, at least according to the literature, despite the fact that there are certainly, you know, certainly opportunities for economies of scale. There hasn't been much in the way of sustained efforts in Rhode Island. And when we go through this, you'll see that most of local government is actually people and personnel. And a lot of that personnel is at the line level. So consolidation doesn't help with respect to that. But there are things, for example, capital, administration, technology, technical services that do lend themselves more to consolidation. Let's go to the next slide. Going to talk about our methodology here. So it's important for you to know there's kind of two main data sources we're using. One is the Municipal Transparency Portal, which is a pretty recent invention, and it requires cities and towns to submit their financial data and in fairly small itemization to the Office of Municipal Affairs, which then publishes it. And so we're using that data, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And then the other big data source is the U.S. Census Bureau, which is a survey of state and local government finances, which is useful for us to compare at the high level, at kind of the state level, not at the municipal level. So one of the the limitations of the MTP is, first of all, that OPEB, which is other post-employment benefits, it's essentially retiree health, is accounted for separately as an other item, and it is not attributed to the functions of government. So police, for example, police retiree health is not in the police costs, which we think it should be, and not. So it's kind of in the aggregate. The other is that debt service costs are not attributed to the municipal departments, and it doesn't include capital spending, and it doesn't include water, sewer, and stormwater. So there are kind of idiosyncrasies in this data set. The Census Bureau, on the other hand, does include it does have a more inclusive level of spending, and we're going to talk about how the MTP is kind of good for some things and not as good for others. Let's move on to kind of the big picture. So RIPEC has reported on a lot of this data before. We have a Howard Island Compares report that comes out every year. But according to the census data, Rhode Island, our combined state and local spending, we're relatively high on a per capita basis in terms of our spending. You'll see the chart. We're third from the right. We're 14th highest in the country, third highest in New England, slightly higher than the U.S. average. But our spending at the local government level is relatively low. So we're 35th if you just look at local government spending. This is where you see that lack of county government coming in, which is a New England phenomenon. And so what local governments and county governments do in other states, we tend to do at the state level. And so, for example, public health is in Rhode Island is essentially an entirely state function. If you go around the country, that tends to be a local function. It's a county or city function. And the next slide. So this slide, we've included education to give you a picture. Now, the education in this graphic includes state and local money, so includes state education aid, but it gives you a sense that almost 60% of the spending at the local level, if you include education, I know many of you don't in your budgets include state aid to education in your budgets, but we do for RIPEC's purposes. So 60% is education, and then the other services, which we're going to talk about now, make up the rest. The most is police, and fire comes next. Public safety together is about 20% of this big pie. Let's go to the next. We're including education in this slide as well, just to show you that municipal government spending is mostly on people. So you can see here, personnel is almost 3/4 of the total expense. Operations about 20%. So it's important, and you all know this, that municipal budgets are primarily driven by staffing expenditures and by people. And it's fairly different than state government in that way. Next slide. So now we're excluding education from the picture, and we're looking at municipal spending per capita. Rhode Island, it's about $1,600 per person spending at the local level. There's a very big variation among communities where we've presented here the top 5 and the bottom 5, where we have all these in our data sets in the report. And these differences reflect property wealth and history and cultural choices and decisions about what level of services to provide, particularly whether you do volunteer or fully staffed fire or trash removal, or you have gravel roads and paved roads. One thing I wanted to point out, though, is the per capita measure has some limitations because it's based on permanent residents. So it doesn't account for seasonal residents or visitors or business visitors or tourists. So you're going to see in some of this data, for example, you see here of these 5 highest spending communities, 4 of them are second home communities, and Providence has a lot of business visitors. So that this is in part a denominator issue when you use per capita. So just bear that in mind. Interestingly, South Kingstown has some second homes, is a fairly low spender, but I just caution you when we look through some of this data that per capita is a good starting point, but it doesn't necessarily capture a lot of these things, and we're going to talk about as we go. So let's dive into some of the key services. Start with police. So Rhode Island is a relatively high spender on police. We're 7th highest in the country. What's interesting is that local government contributes a slightly smaller proportion than the US. And so if you see that, US is, I think it's the number there is about 86%, and in Rhode Island, local government is about 80%. A part of it is the lack of county government. We have a state sheriff's office, and we have a state, court, police. But even then, even though we're slightly below in proportion, our local government spending on police is 7th highest. So we're still pretty high. And then just to point out that after education, police is the largest. It's about a quarter of the total of the remaining, and expenditures on police are almost entirely personnel. So you see here 92.5%. The other thing I'm sorry, am I on the wrong slide? Maybe I am. You could go to the next slide. Sorry. So this is just how police funding breaks out. What's interesting to me is that if you look at this chart, and we haven't presented it this way, but operations is at 7.5%. So you have 92.5%. Only 44.8% is compensation and straight salary, which is just kind of mind-boggling to me in terms of like where the money goes. So the amount that's spent on non-straight salary compensation, overtime, and benefits is almost as much as the straight salary itself. Let's go to the next slide. This is police spending per capita. Once again, we have pretty wide variations. The overall state total is 403 per capita, but we have this is the top 5 and the bottom 5, and you can see that that there's a pretty big variation. What's interesting is even municipalities that spend at relatively low levels are pretty high spenders compared to other places. So the bottom 10 spenders in Rhode Island on police average about 266, which is more per capita than Massachusetts statewide, Vermont, and Maine statewide. So we're even at the low end, we're pretty generous spenders on on police. So when we look at benchmarking police expenditures, we usually focus on staffing, since the function is so personnel heavy. And our officers per capita in Rhode Island is actually pretty in line with the region, which means we spend a fair amount per officer. But per capita is has some limitations because it doesn't reflect the demand for service. So the literature often looks at this calls for service as a better measure as to how much police you should have. But Rhode Island, we only have 12 municipalities that actually report this data. But it's interesting because, for example, I talked about Newport. So Newport has about 50% more officers per capita than Warwick or North Kingstown. But if you look at calls for service per officer, they're about in line with those two communities. So it shows, Newport has 50% higher demand in terms of call for service. But even calls for service have some limitations. For example, Providence has high staffing, but they also have a lot more patrol. They have big events. They have, just patrol functions, business. They're the capital city. So you have to account for some other things as well. Let's move on to fire. So we talked about how police spending is relatively high. Spending on fire protection is even higher still. So we're third highest in the country, far and away the highest in New England. And this is, by the way, fire protection is an entirely municipal function, so it's easier to compare. There's essentially no state expenditures in the United States on to speak of. It's minuscule on fire protection. 20 out of our 39 municipalities have paid fire departments, including our 6th largest. They include emergency medical services as part of fire, so that's important. That's true in many places around the country, but not all. It is the second largest non-education expense. Rhode Island spends almost as much on fire protection as on police. And like police, the money goes almost entirely to people. And I pointed out to you how small that proportion of the straight salary is. It's even smaller for fire. So out of that 91.2, only 39.5, which is less than half, actually goes to straight salary. The rest is overtime and benefits, which is pretty astounding. I think if you think about a normal organization, to have benefits that are that high. Now, to be fair, some of those pension benefits are legacy and don't actually go to the firefighters who are actually on duty. And then when we look at comparing municipalities, once again, there's pretty wide variation on a per capita basis. This is the top 5, bottom 5. We're only looking here at communities that have municipal fire departments. So that's the 20. We're not looking at the other 19 that have much lower costs if they have volunteer. And even Central Falls, which is the lowest spender at 237 per capita, spends more than the US and more than every other New England state on fire protection. So like police, since fire protection is a personnel heavy enterprise, tend to look at staffing levels when we benchmark. Unlike police, where staffing was generally in line with regional benchmarks, in the case of fire, our fire staffing is fairly high. We have the highest number of firefighters per capita in the country. It's like 2.1 per 1,000 versus 1.3 for the US. We have wide variations on staffing among communities. And once again, the per capita may not be the best measure, but only 3 communities actually report calls for service. You should know, even when you look at calls for service, the calls for medical service is multiples of what the calls for fire are. And nationally, the calls for fire are declining over time. So this is the demand for fire, straight fire protection is a diminishing demand over time as we've gotten better at preventing fires through building codes and other measures. We do have an old housing stock in Rhode Island, though. Going to touch on just a few other functions. Want to make sure we have time for questions. Administrative spending in Rhode Island is fairly high. Much more of this expense is at the state level, which reflects the lack of county government. Administrative spending by local government in Rhode Island is relatively low. You'll see here that unlike fire and police, you have more spending on operations and contract services on the administrative side, on the municipal side of things. And once again, spending on administration, the differences among communities are wide. Here you have the top 5 and the bottom 5. And the high spenders tend to be the smaller communities. Now you see here, these are mostly vacation communities, but if you saw the whole outlay of this, you'll see that even the non-vacation smaller communities tend to be high spenders on administration. You see here the smallest 10 communities spent 30% more per capita. And then just to touch on a few other things, public works, Rhode Island is a decent spender on public works, slightly below the US, kind of in line with the region. You have some 2 rural states that are bigger spenders, but our local communities actually contribute a relatively small portion, even when you compare to New England, which is a place that doesn't have a lot of county government. So we have the state. So overall, we're doing well, but the state is carrying a much more of this expense. And then, public works is more than just roads. So at the state level, about 80% of that spending is roads and highways. At the local level, only about 45%. So a lot of it goes to trash removal and solid waste. So local governments in Rhode Island spend significantly less on roads and highways than is typical nationally. We're fourth least among all the states on spending on roads. And then this is just spending on function by function. When we talk about public works, and we're going to talk about parks, because the MTP does not include capital, these numbers are not that reflective, but we just wanted to show you that a lot of it is on operations. But the truth is that in many municipalities, a lot of public works spending comes through bond issues and borrowing, and that's not reflected in the MTP number. But you can see that majority, unlike, the majority is on operations, unlike in-house staffing, which is important. And then when you look at per capita, and once again, because of capital costs, there's definitely a big qualification on this, but you can see here, this is the bottom 5 and the top 5. The smaller communities tend to spend more on this per capita. Some of that is they have a lot more road miles, but it is interesting that this is a capital intensive function. And then I just wanted to touch on parks and recreation. So and we've written about this before. Rhode Island, from a combined state and local point of view, is a pretty low spender on parks and recreation. As you can see, we're over 50% lower than the US average. We're 8th lowest among states, and local governments contribute a smaller proportion than the US. And it's somewhat of a New England thing, but you can see here that local governments are fairly low. in terms of, fourth lowest among states, second lowest among the New England states. And then the next slide, Parks and Recreation is a more personnel heavy, about 70% personnel. Once again, we're using the MTP, so we don't have the capital spending in this. So we're only getting some of the picture when we go to this, not the prior slide, but when we go to this slide. And then when we look at, this spending on a per capita basis, we have certain communities that spend, very little. And then we have communities that spend a lot per capita. And so on the next slide here, you'll see, some of this is that denominator effect, but these are all beach communities that are spending, that's where their spending is on their beaches, and they're taking money in for that. But kind of big differences here in terms of spending on Parks and Recreation, which is a relatively small function anyway, but definitely both on a combined state and local basis and on a local basis, we don't invest a lot in Parks and Recreation. And then let me just move on to our findings. So we're one of two states with no county government. We have a high concentration of local governments, per geography, and this fragmentation can increase costs. So, what we're trying to do in this report, a lot of people say, well, the whole problem in Rhode Island is we have 39 cities and towns. It's, I don't actually buy into that, although there are definitely potential and opportunities to have greater efficiency through consolidation of services. I think consolidation of municipalities is not likely to happen, but it's also important to understand that a lot of municipal government is personnel, and a lot of that personnel is at the line level. We spend a lot on public safety, and we spend relatively low levels at the municipal level on public works and Parks and Recreation. That we are lacking some data. We don't have calls for service data from all communities, and we also have these limitations of the MTP with respect to OPEB. So actually, those numbers for municipalities are somewhat understated because they're not including some of those legacy retiree health costs or the current. And then, not including debt service, at least in those debt heavy functions like public works and Parks and Recreation, give us only a limited picture of what's happening. And then, so, our recommendations are to slow the growth of spending on police and fire, and to get better data about those decisions. I would say that throughout this report, you're going to see wide variations among communities, which is actually fairly surprising to me. You would think that communities would be closer benchmarking on some of these things, but so it does raise questions about what's the appropriate staffing levels, what's the appropriate level of expense. Definitely you see staffing differences in both police and fire that cannot be explained by demand for service or other things. It just shows a larger spending. And then incentivizing consolidation, shared services, particularly in there is evidence in this report that small communities do have some inefficiencies because of economies of scale, but the places to do that are places where you can achieve those economies. So that's usually in capital, technical services, IT, and administration, places where you can actually realize that. And then, the state should be helping to incentivize that. And then I'm sure you all agree that the General Assembly should avoid making mandates without considering what the costs of that are. And then on, public works, we think a municipality should invest more in roads and highways. I know that's a very expensive proposition, but the data tells us that those investments are low, and also that the municipal investments in parks and recreation, natural resource. And what's particularly interesting about that is that the relatively small number of beach communities are carrying a big, so when we look at like the total municipal spend, it looks very low, but it's actually, if you ever were to take out those beach communities, it would be extremely low for the rest of the municipalities. And then just to continue, the municipal transparency portal is a great resource, but it would be better if we could have a more complete analysis and be able, for example, to track capital and some other things. So I'm going to start there. We have quite a bit of time for questions. Sure, there are a number of them.
As for questions, you folks do have the ability, this is a meeting, not a webinar, so you can take yourself off of mute and go ahead and ask questions that way, use the raise hand function or the chat. And I see we have one question in the chat already from Andy Noda. As these reports reflect a point in time, is the vision of RIPEC to have everyone focus on the funding, in spite of the fact that in Rhode Island, the likelihood of making some of these changes is very unlikely, or only on a long-term incremental basis, based on our cultural makeup and history, and our political leadership, strong advocacy groups, and general Rhode Island resident stubbornness. Can RIPEC dedicate some added time to discuss these findings in a more intimate setting and be able to drill into the details further and other impacts that are at the root of some of our own municipal challenges? Thank you. Oh, there's Andy. Go ahead, Andy. Did you take yourself off mute?
Yeah, I did. Thanks, Mike. Thanks for the presentation. I know you and I have spoken before about trying to find some time when we can kind of drill into the issues. And for me, and you and I have talked about this briefly in the past, is I'd love to look more at a distribution both on the municipal and education side of state funding and federal funding, where that funding goes, and kind of what that drives on. It might be eventually an uncomfortable finding for some of us on this call in our communities. And as you know, through the League of Cities and Towns, we unify our position when we can, but many times we have competing interests, right? So you touch upon a lot of things in the report on a spot in time, which are all notable and we should all be focused on. But again, lifelong Rhode Islander, 32 years in municipal government, know that many of them won't be achievable during my career. They'll take that long to actually effectuate amongst all the players in the state. But I'd love to really focus on who's actually I don't want to put words in your mouth. I think you're focusing on who's efficient, who's not, right? Where does the money go? Is it a good return on investment? Is a particular city now dependent on state and federal funding and not making critical decisions where other towns don't get certain funding, might have to operate and manage themselves differently? I'm trying to kind of take in all that information and understand where RIPEC stands in terms of its outside observation of all of us, knowing that we're all so different.
Yeah, so we have the luxury of being in our ivory tower a bit and present this data to you, but we actually, I've certainly been exposed to the political realities in my career. We did a report. If you look at the series of our reports, I mean, one of our premises is that municipalities don't even resemble each other in Rhode Island. I mean, they're not. I know you have the league, but I mean, in terms of your tax base, your ability to actually fund services. I mean, there are many communities that cannot fund their schools without help. So, the idea that they actually control their finances. So, there are a lot of realities, the realities of binding arbitration and minimum staffing and fire contracts. But when you look as a whole, we start to think about, and we've recommended more state funding for education, particularly for the poorer communities, to take that burden off. When we think about roads, you know, we think about police and fire staffing. I know there's limitations in contracts. However, some municipalities seem to be staffing higher than they even would be required to, if you look at the amount of staffing that they have. So that raises questions. I think, you know, to me, the roads, certain communities are really struggling to get money to pay for roads and the quality of roads. So maybe we should be thinking more creatively about perhaps taking some of the school bond debt off of cities and towns, since they're getting reimbursed, and perhaps finding a way to free up, you know, more bond cap, or maybe the state has to help with some municipal. I know there is some small funding for municipal infrastructure and municipal, you know, maybe it has to come more through that, but I think we need to be more creative on the parks and recreation side. A lot of what we're doing is at the beaches is revenue generating. It's not even, I mean, some of them are making, you know, some of those communities are making money on those functions. So those are actually money making functions. So I think we should, you know, look more creatively. The other, you know, the kind of last thing I say is, we're all talking about relative spending, and we try not to call out people for being inefficient. They respect culture, you know, they're cultural choices of, you know, Hopkinton doesn't want to provide the same level of service. Cumberland doesn't want to tax their citizens as much as other places.
Exactly.
So I think we need to accept that that's what those communities are doing. That's a long answer. Sorry.
I'm right with you, Mike. Thanks. I'll follow up with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Patricia, do you have a microphone, or would you like me to read? Okay, go ahead and you can ask your question.
So I had to chuckle a little bit, Mike, when you mentioned slowing the growth on police and fire. That is a difficult thing to assess. So I guess I'm just wondering if RIPEC has any recommendations on this, whether you can share that with us. These are difficult decisions, as I indicated, as we all know, through contract negotiations. We did agree in our second year of our contract to go through a process of hiring a consultant to perform a review of public safety facilities, equipments, and whether additional services are needed. So I guess I'm wondering if you have any information that you can share with us as we go through this process in the upcoming year.
Well, we talked about, you know, we went back and forth about slowing the growth. Our recommendation, if we were aggressive, would be to reduce spending on police and fire. We didn't think that was a reasonable, you know, it's, if you have minimum staffing in fire, you got to try to find a way to probably get some relief from that. I don't know if people have minimum police staffing in their contracts. I'm not sure it's as prevalent as a fire, but, you know, do you need to hire, you know, do you need to fill? Providence has not, you know, the size of their force has come down quite a bit. Providence recently got very generous increases in pension contributions from their police and fire, much higher than you see in other cities and towns. So, I mean, that's a, you know, that's a possibility. You know, how they did that, I'm sure they paid premium and raises. So in the short term, they're probably paying for those increases in contributions. In the long run, though, that's going to make a big difference to have those contribution levels that high. You also have, you know, a lot of this, there's a lot of overtime, right? And higher, you know, it's harder to control fire with that, but, you know, on the police side, you know, you need to look at whether there are certain structures that can be in place to reduce sick time, but these are, you know, these are hard issues. But what we tried to point out, it's a zero-sum game in your budget. I mean, you're not spending on some other things if, you know, once again, if you believe you're overspending on it, and you have to look at the, you know, at the measures. It's hard. It's, you know, it's hard to measure these things. You can't use crime rate. You can't, even calls for service, by the way, from the research, you actually have to dig into the actual, what the calls are about. And very few communities, I think Providence has some data on that, but nobody else does that. And Providence doesn't have the resource to actually analyze it. So.
Yeah, we looked at that in arbitration with the fire in North Kingstown some years ago, but it's interesting how they swap their time out and they get overtime, and yeah, so that's a pretty interesting thing to look at as you're analyzing your budgets, but they're a tough entity to fight against. So,
And
and then we know what happened with the legislation, so everything that they get overtime, you have to pay time and a half. So
yeah, the work week change at the state level was, was not helpful, but, we are culturally, I mean, that's why looking at the history, we are who we are. There's reasons how we got to where we are, but it doesn't mean that, things can't change.
thank you.
Other questions, folks?
Hey, Jen, I'll take another bite at the apple from Mike.
Sure.
Hey, Mike, I looked at just the incredible benefit of what our federal delegation did during COVID by getting us kind of qualified under that county form of government in terms of the added funding that we received. And I see a lot of what you're presenting in terms of public safety and fire and DPW and consolidation kind of fitting that missing piece in Rhode Island in terms of the county form. I mean, do you think there's any value there? I mean, we talk about incremental long-term achievement. That might be kind of like a regional school system. That might be a model, even if it's done with just a few communities, where we can start to knock some of those walls down and bring them together. It looks like there might be a lot of value because a lot of what you just presented would be addressed in a county form of government, I think, anyways.
Yeah, I think particularly on the administration side. So, and Ernie and I have talked a little bit about this, but I mean, to me, and one thing this report didn't get to is not only the economies of scale, but the economies of expertise that small communities don't have. So do you have the ability to hire an IT director at the salary or a finance director at the salary you need to? And so I do think there's a tremendous value. And in my, my small interactions with some governments, many municipalities are behind the state in terms of, automation, paper bound, in terms of IT. I mean, when I get to the state, it was like, oh my God. And now I go to some of the municipalities and I see that you guys are even more paper bound. So I do think there's a value of, and maybe this is where state seed money could create, for example, an IT resource that municipalities could opt into. And I know Ernie's thought about that, or for example, a financial back office that could process payments. I don't think you can give up the finance director. Some of these functions like finance director are discretionary functions at a state, even you could perhaps share IT, but even that, maybe the head of that is a little harder. But I do think a lot of these back office administrative functions, and then capital, equipment. I mean, I think that's when we see the smaller communities and the economies of scale. I have to think that some of that is, can they actually utilize all of their highway equipment efficiently and things like that? So could there be some room for a privatized equipment provider that could, produce all the heavy equipment and keep it all working? So I think those things, obviously there's no incentives if the state doesn't, but maybe the state could do the startup costs or pay the first year. I think that would be a tremendous, because I see that as a struggle as cities and towns, as the demands get more technical and more capital intensive, particularly IT, it becomes a real struggle for small communities.
Any last
Mike, this
questions?
is Ernie. I just want to thank you and Justine. It's a pleasure to work with both of you, and Mike, great presentation today and helping us with your reports to make us think and to think about how we're doing business and how we can do it differently. So thank you for sparking that interest and giving us documents that we can use as a resource too.
Thank you.
All right, if there's no further questions, just want to say a big thank you to everyone for attending. And of course to Mike and Justine for a series of really great reports and research for us to dig into. And we will, I guess this is our last workshop Wednesday for the year. And we'll see you on, I believe it's the 6th will be our next one. So I will be in touch via email for all of you on that. Thanks so much.
And just
Have a
one
great-
other thing too,
Oh, yeah, please.
Jennifer, just to thank you too for putting all these programs on. So thank you for the great work you did putting these together for all the cities and towns.
Thanks, Ernie. My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Have a great holiday season. Take care. Bye.
Bye, everyone.